In order to give the exact idea of how hot it was over there in that part of the Sahara where Christopher was traveling with the truck driver and his freezer, the writer has given us he has quoted the right or exact words of Christopher in the lines. Everything was dead and dry and hot. My mind was foggy. I was on fire. The inside of my head felt dried up and my lungs hurt from the hot air. There were times when I tried to make myself faint, but my head was pounding with such pain that it kept me conscious. So it's really very obvious, very clear how hot it was. The Christopher's words are quite evident of what he was feeling at that time. So he felt that everything was dead and dry, everything was hot in his it was too hot that his mind wasn't working, it was just foggy, and he couldn't think about anything clearly. I was on fire, and he felt that he was just sitting on the fire. It was so hot that he felt that he was sitting on the fire, and in the inside of my head felt dried up. Even the head inside, he felt that it was dried up. As he was feeling thirsty, so he felt that his head was even dried up, and my lungs hurt from the hot air, and as it was too hot, the hot air blew and it was being inhaled into his lungs. And there were times when I tried to make myself faint, and he tried to make himself faint so that he can escape the hotness, he can escape the feeling of hotness, the bad feeling of hotness, but he couldn't even faint himself. But my head was pounding with such pain that it kept me conscious, that because of the hotness he was unable to faint himself into sleep. And the outpost was discovered at last, and it contained a well full of cool water. And now finally they approached, they reached an outpost of water. There was a well, and that well was full of water, and that water was cool. So they were blessed to find or to search this outpost. They drank until they could drink no more. They drank the water of the well until they to their full, and when they had no thirst, then they left it. They certainly needed to drink water, because they had faced or encountered the very hot temperature for last many hours. The heat was incredible. The heat was just incredible. It was unbelievable, unimaginable. It was too hot. In the shade of the mud house, the temperature reached 130 degree Fahrenheit, while out on the sand, the thermometer registered 165 degree Fahrenheit, which is nearly 30 degrees higher than the highest temperature officially recorded. So the temperature of 130 degree Fahrenheit and 165 degree Fahrenheit, obviously it gives us the idea how hot it was. Aigolia, 100 miles on, was reached without further mishap. Now they didn't have to encounter any further mishaps, and they reached Aigolia, and it was 100 miles. It was on the distance of 100 miles. It was a fascinating little town. So Aigolia was a fascinating, attractive, good little town, a small town. It was a true oasis. It was a true oasis, means there were plants, there were shrubs, there was water, with so much water available that they hardly knew what to do with it. So these people had so much water available that it was just a spare with them. They had a spare amount of water with them, and they didn't know what to do with it. Every day of the week that he was there, Christopher spent hours bathing in a little pool half a kilometer from the center of the town. So he had found a little pool of cool water, and which was half kilometer from the town, and he used to sit in that pool, and he used to bathe for hours and hours. shaded by palm trees and fruit trees, and this pool was shaded by palm trees and it was shaded by fruit trees, or lying on the cool grass beside the pool, or he used to sit in the pool, or he used to lie down on the grass which was near that pool, watching the birds feasting on the dates. And he used to see the birds, they were feasting, they were eating dates on the palm trees. What a contrast from the desert all around it, and he could rightly feel or he could rightly realize the contrast, the difference between the atmosphere or the weather in the desert and the weather in that area, that is Aigolia, which was surrounding that desert part. The journey from Aigolia to Insala was not without its excitement. So then they had to travel from Aigolia to Insala, and the journey between these two towns, these two little towns, that was also full of excitements. It was made in a heavy truck carrying 10 tons of ammunition, and that he had to travel in a heavy truck, and in that heavy truck it contained 10 tons of ammunition, driven by a particularly able and experienced driver who made his way across the apparently trackless desert. And the driver was skilled, and he made his way in a trackless part of the desert. Means the desert was just trackless, the path was not clear. It was a source of contrast, amazement to Christopher, constant amazement to Christopher, So Christopher was just amazed, he was just surprised to see the skill of the driver, that he could travel in a land which is quite trackless, which is pathless, which has no points or no signs of the route on which they had to go, but the driver was skilled, so he had made his way. During the next day, Christopher suffered one of his worst experiences. The next day Christopher had to suffer worst experiences. Behemoth assured him that it would be a good thing to mix a little wine with his water. So Behemoth, that is the driver, had convinced him, that he had insisted him that he could mix a little wine with water, so it will give him a good feeling. Christopher was doubtful, but he risked it. Christopher was doubtful to have wine, but still he got it. He had it. He drank the wine, the water mixed with wine. The result was disastrous, but he had to bear the harmful results. During the heat of the day, they were lying in the shade of the truck, and now in the heat of the day, because of the effect of the wine, he had to lie under the shade of the truck in the hot weather. The two Arabians asleep, and both the Arabians were sleeping. Wanting something from the driver's cabin, he got up to get it. As he was climbing up, he was suddenly overcome by a strange sickness, and he in order to get water from the driver's cabin, Christopher climbed towards the truck, but he had to he was overwhelmed by a strange kind of sickness because of the effect of the wine. His head started to pound, and he found himself shivering violently. He knew he was going to collapse, so he made a desperate effort to avoid the blazing sand. Now he knew that he would just fall down, and he tried to remove himself, to go away from the blazing sand, from the hot sand. His fall, as he blocked out, fortunately woke the other two. Now his fall, when he fell down, as he blacked out, as he just fainted, he fell down, and because of the thud on the sand, the other two people just woke up, and they dragged him completely into the shade, and they dragged him towards the shade. For an hour he could not speak. Now for the complete hour he could not speak. His two companions took off their turbans and poured water on them, using them to rub his body gently in order to keep his temperature down. The other two men tried to keep his temperature down by rubbing the wet turbans on his body. Then when he recovered his senses, they gave him as much water as he could drink. Now when he came towards his senses, he came out of his faintness. He was given water by the two men and he drank it. The quality of the water is not the only respect in which Insula differs from Aigolia. The later town, with its shady swimming pools and its luxuriant trees and plants, has triumphed over the barrenness of the desert. He tells us that Insula is quite different from Aigolia. Aigolia was a shady town with cold water and swimming pools, and it had luxuriant, very rich trees and plants. On the other hand, on the contrary, this town, that is Insula, that is just barren, and it is the complete desert area. Insula is fighting a desperate battle for survival. Insula, the people living over there in Insula, they are just fighting for the for survival and perhaps losing the contest, and it has lost the contest in competition to Aigolia. The sand is constantly encroaching on the town, and this sand is constantly overwhelming. It is constantly enveloping the whole town. So this Insula, this town, that is Insula, it is just desert, and it is just a desperate kind of area. Parts of the town are being swallowed by the desert. Giving or quoting Christopher's own words, the writer says parts of the town are being swallowed by the desert. So parts of the town are swallowed by the desert. It is a frightening thing to see. So it is frightening. It is so frightened. It is so fearful to see that the desert or the sand is just covering the whole town, even the residential areas. Man has tried by every means to hold it back. Man has tried hard to hold the sand back and not to let it come or cover the residential area. But in spite of his efforts, the desert keeps tightening its stranglehold. But the desert is just holding its strangle, and it has strangled. It has we can say covered or overwhelmed the whole area. Palm trees that once lifted their branches high above the dunes are now like bushes. So the palm trees, which were once they were so high, they were so good and rich, now they are just like bushes because they are covered by the sand, and some of them are completely covered, and some of the palm trees are even completely covered, and they are not even visible. I bent down and picked dates off some of them. So he had to bend down in order to pick off the dates from the trees, because the sand is too much. It has covered the whole trees, all of the trees. Many people have had to leave their homes, and people have to leave their homes and they have to migrate to the other places because they were being covered by the sand. Their areas, their houses were being covered by the sand. Storm fences too little, if any good. Even if they fix fences against storms, they do not work. They do not work at all. A truck was leaving shortly. A big, dirty, clumsy looking oil truck. Now the other vehicle he had to ride, that was big, dirty, clumsy looking heavy truck, and it was an oil truck. This time the driver and greaser seemed reluctant to take him. Now the driver and the greaser did not want to take him with them, take Christopher with them, although they finally agreed. They did their best to go without him. They tried their hard that Christopher should not accompany them, but finally they agreed to take him with them. It turned out that they believed him to be a Frenchman, and they disliked the French. They disliked the French because the desert area, as the writer had told us, it was under French control. They disliked the Frenchman. When they found that he was American, they became friendly at once. The two people, that is the driver and the greaser, became friendly with Christopher when they came to know that he wasn't a Frenchman, rather he was an American. It was unbearably stifling in the driver's cabin. So in the driver's cabin it was too hot and it was just unbearable. Christopher was completely overcome at one point, and when a midday stop was made at a little mud building outpost, he staggered inside, to the astonishment of the French officer quartered there, and lay down on the floor to be ill. Fortunately, he had recovered by the evening and was able to continue the truck journey. Now, the writer has told us Christopher's experience of just coming out of the driver's cabin, but obviously because of the hot outside, even he got ill, but by the evening he just recovered himself. Tamanrasset was reached at last. So now the next destination, their next point of stay was Tamanrasset, and in Tamanrasset they reached, and here Christopher made out of his most valuable contacts. Now he made most valuable contacts. This was Professor Claude Balangorner, a remarkable Frenchman who has devoted himself to helping the Tuareg people, and he had a good contact, that is Professor Claude Balangorner, and he wanted to see him, and this was a professor who had helped the Tuareg people, and he succeeded in convincing them that education would be useful to them, and so this is the historical importance of this person, that is Claude Balangorner. Then most wisely he adapted himself to their habits and customs, so that he could help them to get the most from their own natural way of life, rather than persuade them to adopt Western habits unsuited to their land and traditions. So this professor was remarkable in the way that he helped Tuaregs, and he asked them to how they can get education. They should get education, and in order to convince them, in order to help these people, the professor had adapted himself to their own atmosphere, to their own customs and traditions, so that he could help them in the natural way of their own living, instead of asking them or convincing them to change their own ways and to develop or adopt Western habits. So Balangorner acted as Christopher's guide, host and friend while he was in Tamanrasset. So Tamanrasset, he was guided and hosted by Balangorner. With his assistance, Christopher was able to spend a week in the encampment of the Tuareg Amanakol. So Tuareg Amanakol means the king of that area, and because of the Balangorner's contacts, he had spent a week with the king, an experience which he found fascinating. This was a fascinating experience to spend some time with the king of that area. The Tuaregs, though their life is primitive, are a people of great dignity, extreme honesty, high intelligence, and with quite an ancient history. So he liked the people of that area, the Tuaregs, and though they had a simple, primitive, initial type of life, and still they were dignified, they were honest, they were intelligent, and they had a long history with them. In preparation for this visit, Christopher learned to ride a camel, a task which he found more difficult than it looks. During his stay over there in Tamanrasset, he learned to ride a camel, which was a difficult task, but he learned it. During his first lesson, he was thrown over the animal's head 3 times and once over its rear. So when he during his first lessons of riding a camel, he had to encounter the mishap of falling down and being thrown down by the animal. Sometimes he fell on his rear, sometimes on his head. It was on its head. It was on his formidable type of transport that he was to continue his Sahara journey. So in the same transport, that is heavy, clumsy oil truck, he had to continue his journey toward in the Sahara. There were no more trucks, as he couldn't have any more trucks, and as he was hitchhiking, he had to be contented whatever transport he was getting, whatever chance he was getting of locomotion from one place to the other. Balangorner arranged for one of his most educated pupils, a young Tuareg noble named Bobukar, to act as guide for the first few days of the 1280 kilometers journey from Tamanrossu to Timbuktu. The start was made at dawn, and they started their journey at dawn, and he had given one of his educated pupils to Christopher as a guide, and his name was Bubakar and Christopher, each on a camel, though both Bubakar and Christopher were riding a camel, and with the third carrying Christopher's supplies, and the third camel was carrying a supply of for Christopher, food and water supply. It would probably be 2 or 3 weeks before the next village was reached, so it was essential for him to take enough food and drink to last that time. So obviously they had the idea that it will take 2 or 3 weeks to reach the next destination, so it was essential to have a good supply of water and food for them. Out in the burning desert, there are no villages to turn to if food runs short, and they had the idea. Balangorner knew very well that if they run short of supply of food or water, they won't be having any village around from where they could get water. So as precautionary measures, they had a good and enough amount of supply for food and drink. The most difficult and dangerous stage of the journey now had to be endured. Now they had to come across the most difficult and the most dangerous stage of journey, and it began when Christopher was handed over by the leader of a big caravan to a small group who were willing to go to Kidal, about 560 kilometers from Timbuktu. Now the leader of the caravan, this big caravan, had handed over Christopher to a small caravan, to a little caravan, and that group of people that was going to Kidal, and Kidal was just 560 kilometers from Timbuktu. The little party, two Tuaregs, a slave, and Christopher, began by setting out to find a well